Hello, everyone. My name is Yoav Waxman, and I'm a professor of economics at Coastal Carolina University. Today, we'll cover lesson 2 for Econ 202, Microeconomics, and this lesson is about elasticity. So you can think of elasticity kind of as a rubber band. Some products are not very responsive, like a thick, rigid rubber band, and they don't respond to changes in prices and income, or some products have a very strong response to changes in income, prices, and other variable. So we say they are elastic. An example of this would be on the right. If you think of gasoline, that's something we need. And if the price of gasoline goes up, we continue consuming it. So there's not a big response in the quantity demanded. Therefore, gasoline is inelastic. But if you go to the convenience store next to the gas station, there are a lot of snacks and they have many substitutes, and they're certainly not something we need. So those products have an elastic demand because if the price of sneaker goes up, we can simply choose another snack or choose not to eat a snack at all. This presentation will examine elasticities, all the different kinds of elasticities. It reviews the price elasticity of demand and supply. We will discuss income elasticity and cross price elasticity, which essentially look at how the price of one product affect the demand for other products. It will highlight real-world examples of elastic and inelastic goods. And finally, we cover revenue implication of elasticities and how companies use elasticity to maximize revenue and profit. So at the bottom, we have a picture that shows the various types of elasticity. Price elasticity of demand looks at how what we buy is impacted by changes in prices and how big that impact is. The price elasticity of supply, number two, looks at how producers and suppliers respond to changes in prices. Is it a big response or a small response? The cross elasticity of supply and demand look at how the prices of other product affect either the demand for a product or the supply of that product. And finally, the income elasticity of demand looks at how changes in income impact our demand for a certain product and how big that impact is. So what is elasticity? Elasticity measures how much quantity respond to changes in price, income, and other variable. As described early, sometimes the response is very small. So there could be a change in income and price, and people still continue to buy about the same quantity of the product. In that case, we say it's inelastic. And sometimes the response is very large. So there might be a small change in price leading to a big shift in consumption pattern, in which case we say the product is elastic. Economists and firms use elasticity to analyze markets and predict consumer behavior. So elasticity is a very important number for economists. If you want to estimate how policy changes might impact consumer behavior, you do have to look at elasticity. Or if a company wants to decide whether to raise or lower the price of a product, they need to understand the price elasticity of demand. So all of those things matter when you make corporate or government policy decisions. Elastic goods respond strongly to price changes because substitute exists. So if you think, for example, for brand of cereal, if you look at the bottom left, there are many brands of children's cereals. So if you just focus on one of them, like Lucky Charm, if the price of Lucky Charms increases, you can switch to another brand like Pops or Crunch Berry or Trix. So there are many options when it comes to children's cereal. On the other hand, think about a life-saving medicine like insulin. Many people who suffer from diabetes need insulin in order to survive. And if they don't have it, they will pay just about anything to acquire it. So the price of insulin can skyrocket, and in all likelihood, most patients would still buy it. When we look at the price elasticity of demand, we're specifically looking at the percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in price. This is expressed in the equation on the bottom left. It's important to note that we're looking at the absolute value. When price goes up, the quantity demand goes down. They have a inverse or negative relationship. So this is going to be a negative number. However, when we look at the elasticity, we're going to take the absolute value, which means basically we're going to ignore the negative sign. If you look at percent change, there are different ways to measure it, but the most common way to measure it is to look at the change in the product over the average. So, for example, the percent change in quantity is the new quantity, Q1, over the old quantity, hence the change in quantity over the average of these two. And the percent change in price is the new price minus the old price over the average of those two prices. However, in many instances, you're going to see people take a shortcut, and instead of looking at the average of the two prices, they might look at the change in price over the old price. And elastic demand says the elasticity value is greater than 1. So if this ratio is greater than 1, means that there's a big response in quantity demanded to a small response in price. And inelastic demand is smaller than 1. That means the percent change in quantity is smaller than the percent change in price. A price elasticity of 0 means no response at all. Whereas a unitary elasticity occurs when elasticity equals 1. So if the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price is the same, you're going to end up with a ratio of 1. It's important to note, however, that for a given product, there could be different elasticity over the same demand curve. And we'll look at examples of that later. Demand varies depending on the availability of substitute. So when we think about elasticity, there are a couple of things we want to think about. One, is it a product we need? Products that we need tend to be more inelastic, or products that are unnecessary or luxury goods tend to have a more elastic demand. And the second question is, are there close substitute or direct substitute? So at the bottom right, we see several examples of direct substitute. For instance, if you like to drink sodas and the price of Pepsi goes up, then you may decide to switch to Coca-Cola. If you like to get your macchiato in the morning and Starbucks just increased their price, you might decide to go to another brand like Dunkin' Donut or Costa Coffee. If you order typically your pizza from Domino's and they raise their price, you might decide to switch to Pizza Hut. All that being said, an increase in price certainly doesn't guarantee that all the consumers switch between the brands, because there is a degree of brand loyalty, and some people are willing to pay a lot more for Pepsi because they prefer it, even though those are two substitutes. So let's take the example of elastic good. Restaurant meals have an elasticity of around 2.27. Remember the rule, if it's higher than 1, we have an elastic good and respond strongly to price changes. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, going outside is a luxury. We don't have to go out to a restaurant. We can eat at home. And secondly, there are many, many restaurants. So for a particular restaurant, if they raise their prices, I could simply choose to go somewhere else. Computers and electronics also tend to have an elastic demand. So computers have an elasticity of 1.44 because substitutes are widely available. In other words, there are different brands of computer. And also because many people have a computer at work, so they may not need a computer at home. Electronics in general show elastic behavior due to technological changes. So if I have a cell phone that I like and somebody else comes up with a new brand, whether it's Apple or Samsung, then I may switch because their brand may have a new technology that didn't exist in my phone. And what we call fast fashion clothing typically show high elasticity. So on the bottom right, we see a road sign that you typically see on the highway, and it often advertises the different eating options that exist at the next exit. And they tend to be very price elastic. So while Burger King and McDonald's and Wendy may have their own special name for hamburgers, they're really producing similar product, and consumers are price sensitive when they choose which restaurant they're going to eat in. On the bottom right, we have a bunch of different candies. So if you imagine you like Kit Kat or Twix or Snickers, if their price increase, you have a lot of other options to choose from. Once again, it doesn't mean that you won't buy sneakers if the price is a little bit higher, because there are preferences and there is brand loyalty to a specific brand. So some people are going to eat McDonald's no matter what the price is, and some people are going to eat Snickers, eat a Snicker bar, even if it's more expensive than a Kit Kat or Twix. How about inelastic good? Well, housing is a great example of an inelastic good. It has elasticity of 0.12. Remember, when elasticity is below 1, it's price inelastic. Elasticity of 0 means it is completely inelastic. So we see that the elasticity of demand is quite inelastic for housing. And there's a simple explanation for that. We all have to live somewhere. And if we work in a particular market, we have to get a house in that market. So even as the price of houses increases, we have to either buy or rent a house. How about electricity? Electricity, as you might expect, is also quite price inelastic. It has a price inelasticity of 0.20, and that is because we have to use electricity to heat our home, to uh, charge our cell phones, in some cases to cook. Uh, so we really don't have an option. If you want to run the dishwasher, we have to use electricity. If you want to run the refrigerator, you have to use electricity. However, there are small things we can do to reduce our use of electricity. So if our electric bill becomes more expensive because the price per kilowatt has gone up, we can do small things like use our heater or AC less. We can also maybe open the windows at night during the summer to help to cool down the house, or open the shade in the winter to let more sunlight. So there are a lot of things we could do. We can use energy efficient light bulbs, better insulate our home. So, so while there are small adjustments we can make, essentially we still consume about the same amount of electricity, even if the price goes up. What about gasoline? Gasoline shows elasticity of around 0.35%. Not quite low or not quite inelastic as electricity, because there are more adjustments we can do here. We could drive less, we could commute, or we could use bicycle public transportation. So there are more alternatives. Increasingly, also, when we see a rise in gasoline prices that's sustainable, more and more people can buy EVs. So there are alternative to gasoline, where if we look at our home, there's really no good alternative for electricity. Cigarettes are inelastic because they are addictive. This brings us to another very important point, is that government tend to tax inelastic product. And it's often referred to as sin tax. So things are addictive like cigarettes or alcohol often gets taxed at a high rate. And in the graph below, we see the tax increasing from 2002 to 2010. The brown part shows you the actual cost of cigarette, while the white part shows you the tax levied by different states. Now, this varies by state, but we see that both the federal tax in brown and the state tax have been increasing during the first decade of the century, and cigarettes have become a lot more expensive. This is what you might consider a win-win solution. There are two possibilities here. Either people will continue buying cigarettes because they're addicted to them and they like them so much, and the government gets to collect more tax revenue, or the tax will push people to quit smoking, in which case we'll have a lower healthcare costs. Speaking of healthcare, if you look at the picture at the bottom right, it shows you a patient being taken care of. Healthcare, as you can imagine, is also very inelastic. If you have a life-threatening condition, if you have a heart attack, you're not going to say no to the ambulance. So healthcare is something we have to get. It's very expensive, but it really has no close substitutes. And therefore, it also has an inelastic price. What about supply? There's also a concept known as price elasticity of supply, not just demand. It measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied to the price changes. In other words, when producers and suppliers see the price of a product rise, would they raise supply by a lot, which means it's elastic, or raise it by a little bit, which means it's inelastic? Supply is elastic when producers strongly respond to prices. Supply, supply is inelastic if producers cannot adjust output quickly. So take the example of housing. Let's say there's a surge in demand for housing in the area because a large number of people are moving in. Well, housing supply cannot adjust very quickly. For developers to build new houses, they have to buy the land, they have to survey the land, put in utilities, and of course, bring construction crew. So the process could take many years. Therefore, housing is supply inelastic. On the other hand, digital products like ebooks and ride shares have a very elastic supply. So if you can imagine there's more demand for a particular ebook, it's very, very easy to duplicate that ebook. Or to take the example of Uber and Lyft, they could provide rideshare. If there's more demand for rides, for example, after a football game or a big festival, all they have to do is raise the price, and more drivers will hop on the road and provide ride shares. So the supply can adjust very quickly. So at the bottom left, we see an example of a construction site. As you can see, it takes a lot of work from purchasing the land, developing the utility, and the many steps that it takes to build a home, to build a house. And on the right side, we see different supply curves. So a relatively horizontal supply curve is elastic. A supply curve that's about 45 degrees is unitary. An elastic curve that's relatively vertical is inelastic. Just like with demand elasticity, supply elasticity is inelastic if the elasticity is below 1, unitary if it equals 1, and elastic if it's greater than 1. So are the example of perfect elasticity. If you think of competitive market, they tend to have perfect or nearly perfect elastic supply. When supply is horizontal, suppliers are price takers. So there are markets where, for example, the potato farmers and corn farmers, where the suppliers face a perfectly horizontal supply curve, like the one shown on the bottom right. They have to accept the market price, whatever it is. If a potato farmer try to sell their potatoes for a slightly higher price, nobody's going to buy it because people consider all potatoes to be about the same. Potatoes are potatoes. On the other hand, there's no incentive for a farmer to sell their potatoes for a lower price because they could sell all their potatoes at the market for the market price. So why lose money? Therefore, we say that these suppliers are price takers and they face a perfectly horizontal or perfectly elastic supply. Now, there are really, if you look at the commodity markets in general, for instance, oil, natural gas, base metal like gold and silver, and agricultural commodity like soybean and corn, these all tend to have a very elastic supply. And the reason for it, they are traded globally. There's a global price for these goods, and the price is constantly posted. So there is a commodity market. The biggest one in the US is located in Chicago, where the prices of corn, potatoes, gold, silver, natural gas are all posted, and suppliers become price takers in these markets. I should note that there's no good example of a perfectly elastic demand, but there are examples of perfectly inelastic supply and demand. A perfectly inelastic supply exists when resource availability, like land, cannot increase. So imagine an area where all the air has been built up, all the land is taken. The supply essentially becomes a vertical line. Even if there's a rise in demand for housing, all the land is already used and there's really no new place to build houses. So all we see is an increase in price with no change in quantity. Another good example of this is an event with a fixed number of seats. Imagine the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl regularly gets sold out. Every seat in the stadium is taken. So if there's more demand for the Super Bowl, you can't really increase the quantity of available seats, and you're just going to see a rise in price. Now, some good could have a perfectly inelastic demand. We mentioned before the idea of a life-saving medicine, something your life depends on. And no matter what the price is, you're going to pay that price. So it's important to note two things. First of all, most of us, thankfully, don't need a life-saving medicine. So the demand is a fixed quantity. The only patient needs it will require medication. And the second thing to note is as the price rises, the quantity demanded does not change. So we end up with a vertical or perfectly inelastic demand curve. Quantity remained constant regardless of the price changes. Now, elasticity has revenue implication. When demand is inelastic, increasing the price raises revenue. So inelastic means that consumers don't respond as strongly to change in price, and the company, by raising prices, can increase the revenue. Where we should note that there are two separate effects. One of them is called the price effect, and the other one is called the income effect. So if you look at the graph on the left, this graph shows you a demand curve. As I noted earlier, different parts of a demand curve will have different elasticity. So if you look at the top left, when the price increases, the kind of pinkish area shows you what we call the price effect. The It's an increase in revenue because you're getting a higher price per unit. But the area in green shows you the quantity effect. In this case, the quantity effect is much bigger than the price effect. We're selling more product, but we're selling fewer of them and losing a lot of money in the process. Compare that to the relatively inelastic demand at the bottom right. Here, when the price goes up, the price effect is very strong. You can see there's a long pinkish rectangle, but the quantity effect is relatively small. So the company, when raising that price, will have a net gain in revenue. There are a few things to note about this illustration. First of all, demand is typically not a straight line, so we don't necessarily see the same effect in every demand curve. And the second thing is that revenue is not the only thing that matters. So yes, there are instances in which companies can increase their revenue by raising price because they're facing an inelastic demand, but they also have other considerations such as client loyalty, and they also have to think about their costs. Product with inelastic supply often create speculative secondary market. So think of the example of the Super Bowl tickets. Those tickets are sometimes sold and resold multiple times. Because there's a fixed supply of seats, you could potentially make money by buying Super Bowl tickets and then going to a website like Ticketmaster and reselling your ticket for a higher cost. There is some uh, examples of this in the corporate world as well. There's a company named Turing Incorporate that acquired a medicine named Darprim, and it's to treat a rare but very dangerous disease known as toxoplasmosis. Now, they purchased those pills at $30.5 per pill, but they jacked up the price all the way to $750 per pill. And because there's no substitute for this medicine and people's life depend on it, they managed to make a lot of profit in the process. Now, you can argue whether this decision was ethical or not, but it was certainly very profitable. How about income elasticity? Income elasticity measures the quantity responded to income. Income is essentially how much money we make. Most goods are normal goods. They have an income elasticity between 0 and 1. So if, let's say, the income increased by 20%, we might increase our consumption of certain good by 5 or 10 or 15%, so less than 20. That would be a normal good. If you think about in the middle, produce that we get from a market, like milk, meat, if our income increase, we'll probably get more of those products, but we don't need to get a lot more because those are just basic things that we need on a daily basis. Similarly, things like driving, right? If our income increase, we may drive a little bit more because maybe go out more on the weekend, but we are very unlikely to more than double our driving if our income doubles because we only need to drive so much per week. Some goods, however, are superior. They have an income elasticity that is greater than 1. Just like with the other elasticities, the elasticity is measured by the percent change in income over the percent change in quantity. So if that is larger than 1, means if our income is increasing, let's say by 20%, we might increase our consumption by 30 or 40%. There are a few examples of this. On the bottom right, we see a variety of luxury goods. Luxury good is something we could typically only afford if we have a higher income. So as our income rises, we're more likely to buy perfume from Chanel or maybe a nice bag from Louis Vuitton, but also things like vacations. Those are another type of luxury goods. So superior goods are goods that we don't typically need, but we desire, and as our income increases, we tend to buy a lot more of them. And finally, there are goods that are inferior. We actually consume less of them as our income increases, which means that the income elasticity of those goods is negative. Those, for instance, include processed food, as shown on the bottom left. So things like microwavable dinners and ramen noodles and canned food are things that we tend to eat when we have low income. But as our income increases, we tend to buy more fresh product and also go out more to restaurants. Inferior good also include things like public transportation. So if our income is low, we may not be able to afford a car, but most of us, unless we live in a busy city, will stop using public transportation as our income goes up. Income elasticity reveals consumers' purchasing behavior. In other words, what products are undesirable, what products are typical, and what products are highly desirable and hence are superior goods. There is another type of elasticity called the cross-price elasticity. Cross-price elasticity measures how price changes in one product affects another product. And there are typically two types of relationship. Goods could be complements, which means we consume them together, and therefore they have a negative price elasticity. Or good could be substitute, which means we buy one or the other, and therefore they have a positive cross price elasticity. So let's look at two examples on the bottom. On the bottom left, we have different types of minivan. So we recently purchased a Honda Odyssey, but we're also looking at other options like a Toyota Sienna. And there are really only four options when it comes to minivans in the United States. If the price of Toyota Sienna increases, some people who are about to buy it may decide to buy a Honda Odyssey instead. So therefore, they have a positive relationship. An increase in the price of substitute will cause you to buy more of the original good. On the other hand, on the bottom right, we see a classic example of two complement, milk and cereal. When the price of milk increases, we tend to buy less milk. But it also means for a lot of people, they're going to buy less cereal because they tend to eat those two goods together. So when the price of a complement goes up, we tend to buy less of the original good. Therefore, we say they have a negative or an inverse relationship. So Domino's and Pizza Hut illustrate two substitutable products. If Domino's increases their price, they're going to drive some of the consumers to Pizza Hut. On the other hand, if Domino's decreases their price, they're going to take away some Pizza Hut consumers. Unrelated product, on the other hand, have a cross-elasticity of 0. So the cross-elasticity is measured by the percent change in the price of the other good over the percent change in quantity of the original good. And if that's 0, it means there's really no relationship between those two products. So to summarize what we learned today, elasticity explains consumers' and producers' reaction to economic changes. Elastic good behave differently in price shifts, income shifts, and shift in other variable. Income across price elasticities provide market insight. So, for example, if I want to promote a movie, I can do it by offering free popcorn because these two things are complementary. Or if I want to drive my competition out, I can lower my price temporarily. Like if I'm Starbucks and then when my competition closed down, I can raise my prices again. So there are a lot of things you can think about. If you're running a resort, you have to be aware that this is a luxury good. So that means that when people's income goes up during an economic expansion, you can raise your prices by a lot and people still come. But when people income goes down, they'll become very price sensitive. So you may want to significantly lower your price and offer special deals because it's hard to attract people to resort at time of economic challenges, like economic recession. Revenue outcome depend on elastic conditions, right? So as we noted earlier, if it's price inelastic, you could raise revenue by raising prices. If it's price elastic, you can raise revenue by lowering prices. That being said, a given product will have different elasticities along its demand curve, and revenue is not the only thing you consider in the company. You also consider your customers' royalty, your long-term strategy, your sales strategy, and of course, your profit, which is revenue minus cost. Understanding elasticities improve decision-making for businesses and policymakers. So let's think of some discussion question based on our presentation. Should government have a price ceiling for product like life-saving medicine? We saw an example in this presentation where a company purchased the rights to life-saving medicine and jacked up the price, making it very difficult for people who need that medicine to survive to purchase. How could producers make demand for their product more inelastic? Can you provide any example? If you want to think about this, that's one of the roles of marketing. So how do you create customers' loyalty and make your demand more inelastic? And finally, what are some examples of inferior goods that you use, and what would you use instead if your income increased? So you can think about this discussion question. I'm going to stop sharing and turn the camera on. So I want to thank you for listening to this lesson and hopefully see you in future lessons. Economics plays an important part of our life, and really helps us with decision making. So I hope to see you in the next lesson. Have a great day.